Hello, this is Thunderbob, and I'm here to talk about my favorite arcade beat-em-up games. This is not necessarily the best games, but rather my personal favorites. I'm going to spend about a minute on each game, detailing some facts, some unique things about the game, and why I enjoy it. Now for my credentials. I grew up in the arcades as a child and teenager, played a lot of beat-em-ups in my day. Then I stopped playing them for about 20 years since arcades disappeared. While more recently I've found myself in possession of a new arcade cabinet, loaded about 1,500 games on it. You can see some video reviews of that arcade unit if you'd care to. In the last 6 months I've played a few dozen beat 'em up games, which helped me put this list together. I have full playthroughs of a lot of these games. I'll put links throughout the video if you want to see more, but we'll get right into it. Coming in at number 10 on my list is Night Slashers from Data East. This game is new to me, but I've played through it several times now. It's a built-in game on my AtGames Legends Ultimate Arcade cabinet, one of the few great beat-em-ups that actually came built-in on the machine. The English version is pretty censored, so the footage I'm including is from the Japanese version. The game has 3 characters, who each have 2 special moves which utilize health to perform. It's pretty standard for the time frame, but I really enjoy it. While the combat systems may not be that deep, the gameplay is shallow, yet fun. The game is pretty short. I was able to beat it in about 35 minutes. That also means you're constantly seeing unique environments and enemies, and it doesn't get old before the end. The thing I really enjoy is the horror thing. I love horror movies and games, and this checks a lot of those boxes. You want zombies? You got it. You want vampires? This game's got vampires. You want to fight Frankensteins, mummies, death itself? This is your game. You should definitely give this one a try. Alright, coming in at number 9 is Battle Circuit, a 1997 game from Capcom. This is actually the last beat-em-up game that Capcom ever produced. This game feels like the spiritual successor to Captain Commando. They both have a very unique and colorful cast of characters. Neither game takes itself very seriously. You're some kind of superhero bounty hunter who's hunting down a computer disk that can destroy the world. It's all very tongue-in-cheek, but it gets the job done. There are 5 playable characters that range from pretty basic superheroes to cat girls, but they get really weird, and you end up playing as a plant monster and even a young girl who rides a pink ostrich. Each character is quite unique with several special moves that make this almost feel like a fighting game. You also earn currency while playing through, which you can spend between missions to unlock new moves or buy a larger health pool, something quite unique in this genre. The game is on the longer end for an arcade beat 'em up. It took me about 50 minutes to complete. I really enjoyed the gameplay, the crazy characters, the ridiculous story. You should give this a try if you liked Captain Commando and kind of those more ridiculous beat-em-up games. Coming in at number 8 is The Punisher. This 1993 game from Capcom is based off the Marvel comic of the same name. This was the beginning of the partnership between Marvel and Capcom that would later lead to the Marvel vs. Capcom games. This game is quite violent, with Frank Castle literally blowing defenseless enemies away during cutscenes. You play as either Frank Castle or Nick Fury, who are basically identical. You primarily use your fists, but you do find a lot of different weapons throughout the game, my favorite being the flamethrower. There are also guns, but these are mostly limited to small sections of levels where you're fighting enemies with firearms. I was able to complete the game in about 40 minutes. I enjoy the game primarily because of its really good use of the Punisher license, really pushing the envelope on what could be done in an arcade game as far as violence and gore and adult themes. The combat's fun, the comic book style is really inventive. This is one of my favorite Capcom beat 'em up games. Coming in at number 7 is The Simpsons. This 1991 arcade game from Konami forms 1/3 of what I consider the holy trinity of classic arcade games from Konami. From what I can gather, this game was developed very early in the life of The Simpsons, as there are several things that don't really line up with the later series. For one thing, when did The Simpsons ever fight zombies, ninjas, and why is Smithers the bad guy? Why is he basically a suicide bomber during the final battle? The gameplay here is pretty simple, with just an attack and a jump, though there are a few moves that can be performed with another player. You can play through the core cast as Bart, Lisa, Marge, Homer. There are some slight differences between them, but mostly it's just the range and the speed of their attacks. They're mostly interchangeable. The game's around 40 minutes long on an average playthrough. The main reason I love this game is that The Simpsons is simple yet fun, and even with the out-of-place elements, The Simpsons show really bleeds through in this game, and this is by far my favorite Simpsons video game. If you have any love for The Simpsons, you really should give this game a try. The next game on the list is Golden Axe: Revenge of Death Adder. This 1992 game from Sega is the arcade sequel to Golden Axe, not to be mistaken with Golden Axe 2 or 3 for the Genesis. This is a different game that has never been released outside of the arcades. The gameplay here is a lot of fun, with attacks that feel quick but weighty. Each character has special moves which cost different amounts of magic pots, some being very strong but expensive, and others being usable multiple times but being less powerful. One of them is even a kind of healing spell, which grows food out of the ground. The effects for each of them are some of my favorite special moves in all the arcade. Just check this one out. This guy's face totally melts. The 4 characters all feel very different and unique, and they have very interesting looks. There's also a ton of awesome writable creatures you come across during the adventure. The game is pretty lengthy, with a little over an hour worth of content depending on the routes you take. This game made my list because of the great characters, interesting special moves, the mounted combat, the setting, enemies, and final boss are all quite memorable as well. This is by far my favorite Golden Axe game. Coming in at number 5 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. This 1991 arcade game from Konami makes up the second of what I consider the holy trinity of arcade games from Konami. This is the second Ninja Turtle game they produced, and I believe it's the superior version to the original. The game's mostly based on the 1987 cartoon, and most of the enemies are pulled directly from it. There is a version of this game for the Super Nintendo that actually has some additional stages and may be superior, though the graphics are a little better on the arcade. You play as one of the 4 turtles, who each have small differences, mostly range, speed. Donatello seems to be able to grab people more frequently, otherwise the combat is all the same between them. It's simple, fun, it's fast. You start out in present-day New York, and you travel through multiple different time periods, the dinosaurs, pirates, trains, all the way into the far future. It took me about 35 minutes to complete this game, so it is a pretty short one. This game made my list because I fondly remember playing this in my childhood. While the gameplay is simple, it's very, very fun, it's addicting. I love the Ninja Turtles and the different time periods they visit. If anything, I do wish the arcade version had those additional stages from the Super Nintendo version, but overall, I really, really do enjoy this game. The next game on our list is Streets of Rage 2. This This is a 1992 game from Sega, by many considered the best to beat 'em up of all time and maybe the best game of all time. While I enjoy it, I think it's been surpassed by a few others. This game has a lot going for it, an amazing soundtrack with a large number of very different levels. The graphics are simple compared to some games out there, but the environments are so different and there's so many of them, it really makes up for it. The combat's easy to learn, but there's a lot of depth to it. There's 4 characters, each with unique moves and specials. Even after playing a few times, I discover fresh nuances to the combat. This is, in my opinion, the most difficult game on the list. I died a lot playing through this game. It's also by far the longest, clocking it at nearly 2 hours. It does start to wear on you a little by the end if you're playing this in one sitting, and I've found I actually prefer shorter games now that I have a family and a daughter and I don't have quite as much time to play at once, but this is still a great game. I really enjoy the music, the characters, the great level design. This is truly a classic. And I would highly encourage everyone to give this a try at least once. Coming in at number 3 on the list is X-Men. This 1992 game from Konami makes up the best of the 3 Konami games on this list, in my opinion. If you had asked me in my childhood, or even 6 months ago, this probably would have been number 1 on my list. But in the last 6 months, since I've had my arcade, I've played dozens of games, and there's been a couple that have surpassed this, but this is still one of my favorites. I grew up on the X-Men comics and cartoons, and a local arcade even had the 6-player version of this game. I have a very large amount of love for this game. This game has a great selection of X-Men, and the 6 characters all feel pretty unique with different attacks and special moves. They look like they're ripped right out of the cartoon. Though this is actually based on the failed 1989 pilot X-Men Pride of the X-Men, and not the better known 1992 cartoon. The levels and enemies are quite varied and unique. The story, while not deep, is good for the genre, though it is quite campy, with a lot of lines feeling like a parody when compared to the super serious movies we get these days.
X-Men, welcome to die!
This game does play a lot like the Simpsons and the Ninja Turtle arcade games, though with the addition of the special moves, it does give you a bit more combat options. This game made the list for the great combat, the characters, the excellent use of the X-Men franchise. It's a lot of fun, brings back a lot of memories of playing this in the arcade with 5 of my buddies. My number 2 game is Dungeons and Dragons: Shadow over Mystara. This is a 1996 game from Capcom, and it's the second Dungeons and Dragons game that they have released. One of the last beat-em-ups that they ever produced, actually. This game is based around the role-playing game and incorporates a lot of the ideas which are rather out of place in the genre. Things like equipable items, leveling up, spell books, branching pathways, all play a part. The gameplay in this is by far one of the most mechanically dense beat-em-ups of the 90s. There are 6 very unique characters that all play quite differently. You have magic users who primarily cast spells from a large rotating list of spells, to fighters who mostly use melee attacks and can even block. There are one-time use items, such as daggers or pots of oil. There's even a healer class who has a very weak attack but is able to buff and heal wounded allies. My first playthrough was as the mage, and by the end of the game I was still discovering how some of the abilities worked. There's literally dozens and dozens of abilities, spells, skills, items, armor, weapons. This is also quite a long game, coming in at around an hour and 20 minutes, with branching pathways that provide unique story along the way. You can miss entire areas of the game depending on the choices you make. This is a new game to me, but it is a pleasant surprise, and it made the list because of the many interesting and unique systems and mechanics that are incorporated into this that most beat-em-up games do not have. It has an incredible level of replay value because of the branching pathways, the multiple unique characters, the different ways you can play, the items, the spells. This is just a really unique beat-em-up, and you should really try this one out. Maybe even play it a few times just to try out all the different classes and the ways you can play this. The final game on this list, and my favorite beat-em-up of all time, is Alien vs. Predator, a 1994 release from Capcom. This game was based on an undeveloped script for a film that was never released, but takes a lot from the previous Alien and Predator films. The story here is actually better than any of the Alien vs. Predator movies that we've received, though that's not saying much. The game takes place in California, that's been overrun by aliens. You make your way through the city, into the jungle, through a military base, and finally onto an actual spaceship. You can play as one of 4 playable characters, made up of 2 humans and 2 predators. They all play pretty differently, with unique attacks and special moves. Each character has a ranged attack that can be used on demand, though they do have a cooldown or reloading time. One of the characters even plays more like a run-and-gun game, with a large ammo pool that reloads quickly. All of the characters feel very strong, and even though the game sends a ton of enemies at you at one time, it gives you enough abilities to keep them at bay. And just as the game starts to get a little repetitive, fighting the aliens, they start to introduce new enemies, like humans, predators, heavy loaders. It keeps you on your toes. The game's about 50 minutes long, with some replayability due to the very different characters, though there's not really any branching story or different paths you can take. There are a ton of weapons that get dropped on the ground you can pick up and use at any time. Guns and swords and melee attacks. Gives you a lot of options, though really you're so overpowered at times you really don't even need them. This is a game that I'm surprised how much I enjoyed it. The combat is so fun, and even though it's difficult, you feel very powerful at all times. The characters are great, the enemies and the setting and the gameplay all did come together in a great way to make this my favorite arcade game. My favorite beat-em-up game of all time. Now I do want to reiterate, this is not necessarily the best beat-em-up games of all time. Just my personal favorites, and I've really limited it to arcade classics. I know there have been some new games that have come out. This genre has actually seen somewhat of a resurgence lately in the indie scene, and things like Streets of Rage 4 just came out. But this is really just classic arcade games. If you have a favorite classic arcade beat-em-up game, I'd love to hear it. If you have a top 10, I'd love to see it. Post it in the comments below. If you like this video, please subscribe. Please leave me a comment. I'd love some feedback. Thank you.